All right, kids, we're going to do another Wednesday, and we're going to do this one with science. And we're going to not do social studies this week and go ahead and get into science. Seeing that we have just so much stuff to cover in weather and continue to cover things in weather, and we are actually a little bit ahead in social studies, we're going to knock this out today. Today, we're going to talk about global air masses. Now, I know in the past couple of days we were talking about the way that wind moves, and I would cover the next portion of wind, but I think that's something that we really need to be doing in class together, where this one, I think it would suffice if we just do it online and we do it remotely. And we're going to talk about these different global air masses. And you can see all of the different ones that you might encounter over the world. And there are some words that I want to get into that I need you to understand before we do anything else. We're going to kind of take a look at a map without all of this on it quite yet. It's a blank map, except for these couple of things here. When we start to dive into the map, I want you to take a look at a couple of words that we're going to see very often. And if I refer back to here, you'll see continental, or maritime. There are two words that we need to become familiar with. And I've got their basic definitions up here. Continental means over land. So if I were to drag this, this would be continental. This is continental. Down here is continental. Even these little islands over here are continental. Up here is continental. All of these places are air masses that would occur over land. The opposite of that is maritime. And maritime are things that occur over water. If we think back to ecosystems, we talked about marine ecosystems were the largest ecosystems because of the oceans. These maritime are anything that's over water. And that could even be like some of our large lakes that we might see as well. And we can cover that later. But for the most part, we're going to be talking about things over large bodies of water like the oceans. So you definitely want to take the time to write down continental means over land and maritime means over water. And if you need some notes for that, sorry about that pause there. If you need notes for that, we'll take a look at this page here, I think. Yes, good. Continental versus maritime. And this is the first thing that we really need to pay very close attention to during this unit. And it's these two words, continental, which we just saw, over land, and maritime is anything over the water. Now, when you're thinking continental, I want you to think of the word continent. Continent. Any of the world's main continuous expanses of land, and that's obviously a definition straight out of Webster's there. That's not how we normally talk. But we're talking about North America, South America, Asia, Australia, Europe, Africa, Antarctica. Your main expanses of land that we think of, and if we look at the map, we can see some of those expanses of land here. We have some North America and a little bit of South America showed in there as well. And it's important to understand those. Now, when we're thinking maritime, we need to understand that these are going to be air masses that form over bodies of water. Again, this is almost what I said when I was talking. Thinking back to ecosystems, marine and oceans. Not much different here. It's connected with the sea or air masses that form over large masses of water. Continental versus maritime is the first and most important thing, I think, in making sure that you don't get things confused. Now, if we go back to our original picture, we're going to notice some other words associated with either continental or maritime. We're going to see some words after those. And we might see polar, we might see tropic, and we might see Arctic. See, polar, tropic, polar. And those are three words that we need to think about that are very important. So again, as we look at all of these here, we can easily kind of start to figure these things out. So if I have the end word being Arctic, and I need to think about what does that probably mean. Well, the one thing that I can think about is, what did I learn about the Arctic when I was studying ecosystems? And we know that the Arctic is a place where it is extremely cold. And they actually define the Arctic air as bitterly cold. Bitterly cold. So if I have continental Arctic, that means it's bitterly cold air that is over the land. If I have maritime Arctic, that is bitterly cold air masses that is over the water. Then I have polar. Now when we think of polar, we think of places that are cold, and that is exactly what this means. Polar means cold air masses. Again, I can combine that with continental to have a cold air mass over the land, and I can combine it with maritime to have maritime polar to have an air mass that is cold over the water. And the last thing that I have is tropic. Now, when we think of the tropics, especially when we talked about that this week and we were labeling areas on the earth, we said that the tropics were very hot or very warm. So when I talk about the tropics, and I'm talking about an air mass, so if I'm saying continental tropic, that's going to be an air mass that is very warm, and they're going to form in very specific places. Summarize polar, tropic, and Arctic. Polar means cold. We know that from ecosystems. Tropic means hot. We know that from ecosystems, and we also we refreshed that again this week. Arctic means bitterly cold. Think Antarctica, something we learned in ecosystems. Again, as I pointed out this week, do you see how it all keeps tying together? The things that we have taught keep tying together, and they're very important that we remember them. So polar, tropic, and Arctic, and I can pair those with maritime and continental. So let's start putting some of these things together. And you'll notice that I've kind of colored in an air mass here. Seeing that I've colored it in blue should give you an idea. So if we look over here, it's pretty close to this. So this is going to be a polar air mass. Where do I find it? I find this air mass over land. Here's where we need to start thinking about things. If I have an air mass over land versus over the ocean, what are the odds that it is drier than the air over the oceans? And you have to think whether it's a warm air mass or a cold air mass. If it's not above a large body of water, the odds are it is drier than the maritime. So when you have maritime air masses, they're going to have more humidity, more moisture in the air. The air masses over land are going to be drier. So, okay, if I know that air masses over land, let me get up here, gonna need this here. If I know air masses over land are dry, whoa, that is not what I wanted, there we go. And air masses over water, come on thing. Air masses over the water are humid, or we can even change that if we needed to. We could go back and change that to moist. They're full of moisture. So if I know that continental air masses are drier, I know that this is polar, so continental polar is going to be a cold, dry air mass. Boom. Continental polar is a cold, dry air mass. You'll see I've added a new air mass to the map. Again, it was really hard to color in the lines here, all right? So I'm a terrible colorer. I colored out the lines. Give me a break. But majority of this is over land, correct? So we know that this is a continental air mass. What's it going to be? It's going to be dry. Now you noticed I did this in red. So it's going to be hot or warm. So this one is a continental tropic. And how would we label that? A hot or a warm, dry air mass. So continental tropic, and again, I'm sorry that these words don't fit perfectly, just deal with it. Continental tropic is a warm, dry air mass. Warm, dry air mass. So continental tropic. And so I had this one which matched the cold. So it was a continental polar. So it was a cold, dry air mass. Down here was red. It's over land. So continental tropic, which was a hot or a warm, dry air mass. Now I have this one pretty close to this color, right? And it's way up here. So further and further away from the equator. We know that this area is not just cold. It is bitterly cold. So it's over a continent, continental. It is bitterly cold. It is dry. It is an air mass. This would be Continental Arctic, a bitterly cold, dry air mass. Continental Arctic is a bitterly cold, dry air mass. Now, if these two happen to swoop down thanks to the jet stream, which we will get to, and this is kind of what we're having here with the polar vortex, that's why it got so stinking cold a little while back. It can get to the point where this is brought down into the U.S., but this is typically not going to make it down to us. It's this air that gets sucked down with the jet stream dipping and making North Carolina super cold. But we'll get to that more when we cover the jet streams. If we look here, we'll notice that, number one, I have placed some of our definitions right over an area that I needed to label, but I also put one over here. And it starts to we start to notice some things. Number one, this isn't over land. This is going to be over water, so this is going to be maritime. It is light blue, so it's polar, so this is a maritime polar air mass. What do we know about that? It's cold and moist, or cool and moist. Maritime polar is a cool, moist air mass. And this is starting to be, Mr. Moses, is it really this easy? I just start to learn that continental air masses are over land and dry. Maritime air masses are over water and they're moist. They have moisture. Arctic is bitterly cold. Polar is cold. And tropic is hot. That's all I need to really know and put them together. Yes, we're putting Legos together just like we've done all week with other things in class. And you know exactly what you're doing. You'll notice there are a couple new spots in here. I have one over here, and I wanted to talk about the Gulf of Mexico a little bit because we're going to be coming back to that when we talk about the Gulf Stream. So you need to know that this is part of this as well. Now, again, we're over water, so it's going to be maritime. It's red, so it's tropic. Put it together, maritime tropic. What does that mean? Moist, hot air. Now let's think about that moist, hot air. Is that going to bring a higher chance of precipitation than drier air? Absolutely. If you have something moving from here over to the States, it's going to probably have a chance of bringing a little bit more rain. Maritime tropic, warm, moist air. And you could take this, if you could shrink it and put it right in here too, and over here, but we're not going to put things over land just so people don't get confused. And we have covered much of our air masses. So as we've covered all of the air masses, we can take a look at the different slides and do a review before we move on and take a quiz on these today. Continental versus maritime. Continental means land. Maritime means over water. All the stuff that you need is right in here. Polar, tropic, and Arctic. Polar means cold. Tropic means hot. Arctic means bitterly cold. And you already know this. Continental, polar, over land, cold. A cool, dry air mass. Literally putting these things together. Again, in the wintertime, if it does get pulled down deep enough, it can cause some crop damage, especially if it gets sucked all the way down to Florida with the jet stream. Again, we'll get to that when we get to jet streams. You need to know a cool, dry air mass for right now. Continental Tropic, okay? And you might notice the little abbreviation here, Continental Tropic. Continental means over land. Tropic means warm. Over land is dry, a warm, dry air mass. Continental tropic air can influence the U.S. in the summertime, and you've seen that get pulled up when we have those heat waves in the summer and things get very, very hot. Maritime polar. Okay, maritime means over the oceans. That means it's going to have moisture, and polar means cool, a cool, moist air mass. Maritime polar, and you see this a lot, especially up here in the Pacific Northwest, near like Seattle and Oregon, where it rains quite often because it's pulled in by this cool, moist air. Maritime tropic. Look at this picture. It looks warm, and it also looks like it's about to rain. Warm, moist air mass. Maritime over the ocean. Moisture. Tropic means warm, warm, moist air mass. Continental Arctic. Okay, Arctic means bitterly cold. Continental means over land. Bitterly cold, dry air mass. And we will stop there. It looks like we'll be hitting weather fronts probably next week. Take the quiz. Knock it out. Don't forget to smash the button and subscribe and like. Later.